In ancient Rome, buying people was as ordinary as buying bread, until odd rules drew invisible boundaries. What made certain trades forbidden, and what secrets about Roman authority and fear are hidden within these bans? Walking through Roman slave markets was like scrolling through an online store, except the items were humans with price tags hanging around their necks. The system ran on pure economics, and the prices? They bounced around more than a cat on a hot roof. A basic slave might cost 500 denarii on a good day. That sounds affordable until you realize most Romans could not even imagine paying that. And here's where it gets surprising. Those prices were far from stable. They fluctuated constantly depending on events across the empire. When Roman legions returned after defeating enemies, they brought thousands of prisoners. Suddenly, the slave markets were flooded with fresh stock. Supply surged, prices dropped sharply. It was basic economics, only human lives were the commodity. Merchants who spent top denarii the week before saw their investments become bargain bin material overnight. Then there was the other side. Major cities like Rome were hungry monsters devouring slaves, faster than they could be supplied. Wealthy Romans needed cooks, cleaners, tutors, and entertainers. Poor citizens longed for even a single slave to ease daily burdens. All that demand drove prices back up again. The strangest part? Every person for sale was displayed like fruit at a market stall. Buyers poked, prodded, checked teeth, and tested strength. These were no longer humans. They were products with quality guarantees and return possibilities. Location mattered as well. A slave fetching 800 denarii in a dusty frontier town might reach 1,500 denarii in Rome's bustling markets. Wealthy Romans had deeper pockets and higher expectations. They wanted the finest, and they paid for it. Wars caused the most extreme price swings imaginable. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul reportedly released nearly 1 million new slaves into Roman markets. Prices plunged so low that some traders complained about being unable to make a profit. Hard to believe, right? They were upset that humans had become too cheap. Yet peace brought other difficulties. Without fresh conquests, supply shrank. Existing slaves aged, died, or earned freedom. Suddenly, traders charged premium prices for what used to be common goods. The system created a bizarre cycle where human suffering directly affected market trends. More Roman victories meant cheaper slaves. Peaceful times meant expensive ones. What determined whether a buyer got a bargain or paid dearly? It depended on far more than basic supply and demand. Roman slave pricing shows how ruthless this economy could be. Elderly or disabled slaves sold for pocket change, sometimes as low as 50 to 100 denarii. These were not viewed as worthwhile investments. They were clearance stock. But here's where it gets interesting. A healthy adult slave commanded around 1,000 denarii. That roughly equaled what a Roman soldier earned in a full year of service. Let that sink in. A single human cost as much as 12 months of a professional warrior's pay. Most Romans could never dream of owning slaves. Ordinary citizens lived paycheck to paycheck, barely covering essentials. Even the cheapest worn-out slave represented months of savings for common families. Slavery was a luxury, not an everyday experience. Consider housing for perspective. A modest Roman home could cost the same as a skilled slave. Families literally had to choose between property and people. Some wealthy households owned dozens of slaves worth more than entire city blocks. Pricing also created strange social dynamics. An elderly disabled slave might cost less than a fine pair of boots, while a strong young worker equaled a year of income. Romans passed slave markets like we might browse luxury car lots, looking but not buying. What is remarkable is the matter-of-fact way they treated these transactions. They bargained over humans like livestock. No moral debate, no ethical hesitation, only business. A slave was an investment for cooking, cleaning, field work, or errands. middle-class Romans faced impossible choices. Save for years to purchase one slave, or spend on land, tools, or starting a trade. Most chose practical investments over human property. Only the very rich could afford multiple slaves comfortably. Poor citizens sometimes labored alongside slaves, earning similar wages for similar work. The irony was clear. Free citizens struggled while slaves enjoyed guaranteed food and shelter. Veterans received land grants worth hundreds of denarii, yet even they rarely splurged on slaves. The math did not favor most people. Serious wealth was required to engage in the Roman slave economy. Prices could shift dramatically based on one crucial factor that altered the entire market. When armies returned from major conquests, the pricing system collapsed overnight. Now we move to the expensive side. Ordinary slaves were one thing, but Romans seeking something exceptional paid dearly. A skilled slave was not simply muscle and labor. They brought expertise, talent, and social status to their owners. Tutors commanded enormous sums of money. We are talking 5,000 to 15,000 denarii for a competent Greek instructor. Why Greek? Romans believed Greek education made someone cultured. A slave capable of teaching philosophy, mathematics, or literature was like having a private university professor at home. Some affluent families paid more for their children's tutor than an ordinary citizen earned in 5 years. Medical slaves cost even more. A trained doctor could sell for 20,000 denarii or beyond. That makes sense, right? A person's life might depend on this slave's skills. Roman medicine was rudimentary, yet a slave who knew how to set bones, prepare remedies, or perform basic surgeries was extremely valuable. Musicians and entertainers commanded staggering prices. A skilled lyre player might reach 10,000 denarii. Dancers, actors, and singers capable of performing for elite dinner guests were luxury items. Wealthy patrons wanted more than amusement. They wanted to impress visitors. But here is where prices became extraordinary and morally dark. Attractive young slaves, particularly for sexual purposes, demanded the highest sums. We are talking 30,000, 50,000, even 100,000 denarii for exceptionally beautiful boys and girls. Romans did not hide this reality. Sexual slavery was fully legal and socially accepted among the upper classes. Specialized agricultural workers were costly as well. A skilled vineyard manager could reach 8,000 denarii, while a regular farmhand went for perhaps 1,000. The difference? Knowledge. An expert vineyard slave understood soil, weather, grape varieties, and wine production. They could determine whether a harvest succeeded or failed. Then there was the legendary case of a scholar sold for 175,000 denarii. That exceeded what most Romans would earn in a lifetime. This was not just purchasing a person. It was acquiring a walking encyclopedia. Someone who could compose speeches, manage correspondence, and negotiate complex deals. Skilled artisans fell in the middle. A talented blacksmith, carpenter, or jeweler might fetch 3,000 to 6,000 denarii. They could generate income for their owners and teach other slaves valuable trades. The price increase was astonishing. Ordinary labor had standard prices, but adding skill, beauty, or specialized knowledge caused costs to soar. Romans recognized they were buying more than workers. They were investing in human capital. Yet all these prices meant nothing if buyers could not assess what they were actually getting. This is where slave markets became particularly strange. Roman purchasers were not wandering aimlessly. They had specific standards for what made a person worth more than another. Age was extremely important, but not always in obvious ways. Young adult males between 20 and 30 commanded top prices. They were at physical peak, could serve for decades, and had yet to develop age-related health issues. A healthy 25-year-old male might sell for 1,500 denarii, while his 40-year-old equivalent went for barely 800. Logical, right? But here is an interesting twist. Children sometimes cost more than adults, especially if trained or showing promise. A 12-year-old able to read and write could reach 2,000 denarii because wealthy Romans saw long-term potential. They could shape these children to their needs. Plus, a child might serve a master for 50 years instead of 20. Gender was another uncomfortable factor. Female slaves faced brutal realities where beauty directly influenced price. An attractive young woman could sell for double an equally skilled man. Roman buyers were straightforward about intentions. They needed women for household labor, but also for sexual purposes. Women with talents such as music, poetry, or basic medicine could demand huge sums. Yet appearance always affected pricing far more than for men. Physical condition dramatically altered value across all categories. Buyers inspected every part of the slave, noting scars, missing teeth, or illness. A limp could reduce the price by half. Poor teeth? Forget top payment. Romans purchased humans as investments, and damaged goods were worthless. Age had different effects for skilled versus unskilled workers. An older artisan with decades of experience could remain highly valuable, while a veteran farmhand became almost worthless. Experience mattered only if the body could perform. The chilling aspect is how Romans calculated these human prices so rationally. They compared slaves like livestock, debating whether youth or skill mattered more for a specific need. A senator buying a secretary cared about intelligence. A farmer needed strong backs and did not care about education. These pricing decisions reveal the cold values of Roman society. Human worth became a formula based on usefulness, appearance, and expected service years. Emotional or social bonds were irrelevant. Yet the biggest price shifts stemmed from something entirely different: the constant wars that supplied these markets with captives. Wars were Rome's biggest business opportunity, not for weapons or armor, but for people. Every major Roman victory turned into a massive slave sale that would make modern Black Friday look calm by comparison. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul were a gold mine. His armies did not just win battles, they captured entire populations. Nearly 1 million Gauls were dragged back to Roman markets in chains. That is like clearing out a modern city and shipping everyone off to be sold. The numbers are shocking, and they caused slave prices to crash faster than a financial panic. Here is the strange part. Slave traders actually began to complain. Yes, they were upset because business was too good. Prices dropped so low that merchants could not make decent profits anymore. A slave who might sell for 2,000 denarii in peacetime now went for only 200. It was economic chaos built on human lives. Then came the huge challenge no one talks about. Managing hundreds of thousands of captives was a logistical nightmare. The Romans had to feed, guard, and move enormous groups of people from battlefields to markets across the empire. Many died on the way or fell ill. The whole thing worked like a twisted version of a supply company, where your inventory could escape or fight back. Yet peace brought its own trouble. When Rome stopped conquering new lands, the flow of slaves dried up fast. Prices shot up like a rocket. That Gallic farmer who cost almost nothing after Caesar's victories could cost 10 times more only a few years later. The laws of supply and demand ruled everything, with human suffering as the foundation. Wars also affected quality. Fresh captives spoke strange languages, followed unfamiliar gods, and often had no skills useful to Roman households. Buyers gambled on whether that Celtic fighter could learn to work in vineyards, or that German tribesmen could manage accounts. Sometimes they got lucky, sometimes not. Even Roman generals calculated profits from slavery before campaigns began. Battles were planned with both glory and business in mind. A victory meant fame, new lands, and huge income from selling prisoners. Wealthy investors in Rome followed military news like traders follow market updates today. A big win in Spain meant cheap slaves for a while. A long, peaceful stretch meant prices were bound to climb again. Despite all this, the trade did have rules, at least on paper. It was not a total free-for-all. Romans claimed to have standards about who could be sold. You could not just grab a random person and take them to market. Stealing freeborn individuals and selling them was strictly forbidden. Even Romans knew that turning citizens into property was going too far. Those caught faced heavy fines, exile, or worse. Roman citizens were meant to be completely safe from enslavement. The law said that no Roman could ever be sold as a slave. But desperate times created loopholes. Fathers drowning in debt sold their children. Others sold themselves to survive. The system had cracks, and people fell through them. Honesty was another concern. Slave traders were supposed to be truthful about what they sold. Selling someone with a hidden illness was illegal. Buyers had certain rights too. If a new slave collapsed from disease shortly after purchase, the buyer could take the seller to court. Age fraud was also banned. Claiming a 40-year-old was 25 could get a trader into serious trouble. Penalties were severe. Dishonest dealers faced ruinous fines, lost their trading rights, or were banned from big markets entirely. Roman law treated commercial fraud seriously, even when people were the goods being sold. These restrictions created a black market. Shady traders operated in alleys and remote areas. They sold stolen people, the sick, and anyone the legal markets refused. Prices that were dirt cheap, but there were no guarantees or protection for buyers. The irony is staggering. The Romans built complex legal systems to control the buying and selling of human beings. They worried about fraud and fairness while turning people into property. The same laws that protected Roman citizens depended completely on enslaving everyone else. Enforcement was far from perfect. Corruption was common, and distant provinces had little oversight. The farther from Rome, the easier it was to trade illegally. These laws and limits shaped the slave economy from top to bottom. They decided who could be sold, where they could be sold, and under what terms. But what was written in law and what happened in reality were very different things. The markets themselves revealed just how strange and cruel the system had become. Walking into a Roman slave market was nothing like browsing for fabric or pottery. The moment you stepped inside, you would see lines of completely naked people standing on wooden stages. Every single one of them, no exceptions. Why naked? The Romans were not being cruel for cruelty's sake. Well, not entirely. Buyers wanted to inspect what they were paying for, from head to toe. Think of it as examining a horse before purchase, except far more disturbing. They checked muscles, looked for scars, and even examined teeth as if buying animals, because to them, that is what slaves were. Around each person's neck hung a small wooden tag or piece of parchment. These were not name labels. They were price signs mixed with simple details. Strong worker, age 25, skilled with vineyards, 3,000 denarii. Sometimes the tags even listed warnings. Lazy, tries to flee, bites owners. Roman honesty at work. The high-priced slaves got special treatment. Educated Greeks or skilled doctors often had longer descriptions listing their training. Knows mathematics, speaks several languages, studied in Athens. These living resumes could cost more than most Romans earned in several years. The strangest detail was the written guarantees. Some traders offered partial refunds if a slave died soon after purchase from a hidden illness. The paperwork for buying a person could be more thorough than modern car sales. Buyers did not just look either. They made slaves demonstrate skills, answer questions, and perform tasks. A musician might have to play right there in the market. A teacher could be tested on reading or philosophy while standing naked before strangers. The wealthiest Romans had favorite markets. Certain locations became famous for their high-quality slaves, much like luxury shopping areas today. These places charged more, but promised better merchandise. Location truly mattered, even in this trade. What makes it even more unsettling is how normal it all seemed. Families wandered through these markets as if they were visiting a public fair. Children went along and learned to judge people as property. The most successful dealers knew their customers well and kept special slaves aside for regular buyers. Personal shopping services, but for human beings. Yet some slaves managed to escape this nightmare through freedom. Freedom was not easily given. It had to be earned, bought, or granted through luck. The journey from slavery to freedom was narrow, but some succeeded. The Roman word for it was manumission. Masters could free a slave through wills, ceremonies, or spontaneous acts of generosity. Some freed their servants after a night of heavy drinking. Yet many slaves freed themselves. They saved every bit of money, worked extra hours, and bought their own liberty. The ultimate self-investment. The price of freedom varied. Skilled slaves might need to pay their full market cost, sometimes more than 10,000 denarii. Others were released for less if their masters were feeling kind or close to death. Some earned it through years of loyal service, or by saving their master's life. Once freed, they became freedmen, a group between slaves and citizens. They could own land, start businesses, and earn wealth, but they still lacked voting rights and could not hold high offices. Roman society never forgot their origins. Even when they became rich, freedmen faced constant reminders of their past. Many became powerful merchants, dominated trade, and sometimes owned slaves themselves. The irony was hard to miss. Former slaves buying other slaves. These new elites built lavish homes, wore fine clothes, and stirred envy among born citizens. But barriers remained strong. Freedmen wore special caps to show their status. Their children could become full citizens, yet high public offices stayed out of reach. Rome loved its layers of rank and privilege more than a cat loves sleep. The numbers tell the story. Over time, hundreds of thousands of slaves were freed. By the height of the empire, perhaps 1 in 10 Romans was a freedman. This created a vast group caught between two worlds, no longer owned, but never entirely accepted. Some rose incredibly high, serving as advisors to emperors. Talent and intellect could lift them far, but never fully erase their beginnings. These freedmen walked the halls of power, remembering the wooden stages where they once stood naked and powerless. Freedom in Rome was not simple. It existed in many shades of gray, with invisible chains that lasted for generations. Even after paying the full price and receiving legal papers, true equality was still beyond reach. The Roman world was built on trade, and at its core stood the buying and selling of human lives.